Hi, let's discuss fee ownership as a type of tenancy.
Ownership. Ownership and the rights between multiple owners is defined by the type of ownership held. In severalty, an individual that owns a property alone holds the property in severalty. In severalty is actually sole ownership. As the individual owner, the person listed on the deed is the person who signs to transfer ownership to another party. However, this may be complicated if the property has been homesteaded and the individual is married. In that case, the spouse, even though not listed on the deed, has rights to the property through the mechanism of a legal life estate. The spouse would be asked to also sign the deed to transfer the property if sold. In severalty summarized, sole ownership, only one party needed to sign the deed to sell unless homesteaded. If homesteaded, then the spouse must sign, even though the spouse may not be on the deed. Co-ownership. If more than one person is on the deed, co-ownership has been established. There are three types of co-ownership: tenancy in common, joint tenancy, or as tenancy by the entireties. This is also referred to as concurrent ownership. How ownership can be held, summarized. In severalty, sole ownership, meaning only one party. Co-ownership, tenancy in common, joint tenancy, and tenancy by the entireties. Tenancy in common. Tenancy in common is a type of co-ownership established for two or more people. With tenancy in common, title is acquired at the same or at different times. This allows for someone to be added at a later time than an original owner. Interest is in the whole undivided property. This means that although parties may share ownership, each has a right to all of the property, not a fractional piece of the property. The percentage of ownership interest, however, may be either equal or unequal. For example, two owners may choose to own a property as a 50-50 equal interest, or they may choose an ownership split where they own the property at a 70-30 basis. Tenants in common have all the bundle of rights, including the right to control and dispose of the property through a will or a sale. If one owner chooses to sell his or her interest in the property, the new owner replaces that person and shares ownership with the other owners. The right to leave ownership interest in property to a person's heirs is called no right of survivorship. Tenancy in common is a common type of ownership and is the default form of ownership in a deed unless wording in the deed specifically declares it to be another type of ownership. Tenancy in common, summarized. Two or more people acquire title at the same time or different times, acquire title on the same or different deeds, undivided possession. Shares of ownership interest can be equal or unequal, and there is no right of survivorship, meaning that you can will to the heirs. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Joint tenancy is another type of co-ownership established for two or more people. One of the big distinctions between tenancy in common and joint tenancy is that joint tenancy has the right of survivorship for the co-owners. Owners, as joint tenancy, may not will the property to heirs upon the death of one of the owners. Instead, the ownership would transfer to the remaining owners. To create a joint tenancy, ownership interest in the property must be created at the same time, meaning ownership is acquired on the same title at that same time. Joint tenants share an equal ownership percentage. For example, three owners as joint tenants would each own 33.333% of the property. It is, though, ownership with an undivided possession of the whole property. Creating a joint tenancy. To create a joint tenancy, four unities must be in place: unity of possession, unity of interest, unity of title, and unity of time. Equal possession of the property with equal interest and ownership conveyed on the same deed and at the same time. Joint tenancy summarized. Two or more people acquire title at the same time. Same time is required. Acquired title on the same deed. Same deed is required. Must have specific wording within the deed creating the joint tenancy. Involves undivided possession. Shares of ownership must be equal between the parties, and there is right of survivorship, so cannot will to the heirs away from the other owner. Tenancy by the entireties. Tenancy by the entireties is a type of co-ownership established for two people that are married. This type of ownership is automatically formed when spouses both sign a deed. The wording of the deed does not have to identify it as a tenancy by the entirety. The existence of the marriage creates the tenancy by the entirety. Tenancy by the entirety share the four unities of possession, interest, title, and time. Tenancy by the entirety summarized. It's exclusive for spouses, and the spouses must be married when they take title. It will automatically be formed if both sign the deed. The four unities must exist, meaning the spouses sign the same deed at the same time, they have equal possession and equal interest in the property. And actions will be required by both spouses in order to transfer the property, meaning they both have to sign the property over to a new owner. And when one spouse dies, ownership interest transfers to the surviving spouse by right of survivorship. At that time, it would become an estate in severalty. This chart shows the four unities of ownership by comparing tenancy in common, joint tenancy, and tenancy by the entireties in a side-by-side fashion. I just really believe that that helps you to memorize and understand how to apply the information. The four unities that you're looking for in the different types of ownership is the unity of the same time, on the same deed, undivided possession with an equal interest in the property. So both joint tenancy and the tenancy by the entirety have four unities of time, deed, possession, and interest. So let's look at and compare what's the same and what's different about these three types. So on the far left, we have tenancy in common. In the middle, we have joint tenancy, and on the far right, we have tenancy by the entireties. So tenancy in common is designed for two or more people, as is joint tenancy. Tenancy by the entireties is exclusive to married couples, so it will always be for two people. Now, joint tenancy and tenancy by the entireties, remember they both have the four unities. But what's different about tenancy in common is that you could actually take possession of the property through a deed at a different time than the other owners of the property. It could be at the same time, but it can also be at a different time. So therefore, it could actually be written up on a different deed. Again, just like joint tenancy and tenancy by the entirety, the ownership deed could be one deed where it's stating out all the names of the owners, but because ownership could be taken at different times, it could actually end up on different deeds. The one thing that is the same for all three of the ownership types is that they're all undivided possession. It's never, well, Tom, you take the top 40 acres and I take the bottom 40 acres, but we own the whole thing together. No, it's if you own this property, you have the right to use all 80 acres because you're in joint ownership of it. That's called undivided possession. Now, with joint tenancy and tenancy by the entirety, you have equal interest. It's always going to be 50-50 if it's two people, 33% if it's three people, etc. 25% ownership if it's four people, because it's always equal. Tenancy in common, on the other hand, allows for that ownership interest to be unequal. One of the biggest differences then is you will see that tenancy in common on the left there has no right of survivorship, whereas joint tenancy in the middle and tenancy by the entireties on the right has right of survivorship. So what that means is that if you own the property as tenancy in common, you can actually will the property to your heirs. But if you own the property through joint tenancy and tenancy by the entirety, that means that if you were to die, instead of the property going to your heirs, it's going to spring back and belong exclusively to who the remaining owners are in the property.